glasses and get this hearing underway, and Congressman Waxman will be joining us shortly, and when he does, we'll interrupt and give him a chance to make his opening remarks. But I want to thank the panelists who are here for this briefing. I've known Drs. Rosner and Markowitz from the lead paint battles, and I have followed Dr. Oreskes' work for a long time. Indeed, the title of her book, Merchants of Doubt, has actually become really a standard phrase in the conversation about the denial industry. And Shauna Thiel represents Media Matters, which does terrific work trying to examine how it is that so many of our friends in the media have allowed themselves to be drawn in by the propaganda machine. The purpose of this hearing is to try to pull back the curtain a little bit on the machinery behind the denial. What the denial apparatus would like is for the public simply to focus on their stable of well-trained scientists who can come out and offer counterpoint to the scientists who are honest and trained and actually know what they're talking about and are sincere in what they do. And then you have the back and forth conflict, and that raises the doubt of which this operation is the merchant. And then people think, okay, that can wait for another day. There obviously is some dispute still on this. It's not a matter that is urgent. I think when you peel back the curtain and look at the machinery that produces that and get a sense that it has produced it over and over again on completely different issues, from climate change to lead paint to tobacco, probably even all the way back to putting seatbelts into cars, but we'll hear more about the history. It's a little harder to accept at face value the propaganda that the machinery is putting out. So if you see only the propaganda, it's easier to accept it. If you see the machinery behind it, it's a little bit harder. So that's why we wanted to have this hearing. These are people who've worked very hard to penetrate the apparatus of denial, to understand it, to explain it, and to watch it through actually relatively minor changes as different issues emerge that require the same strategy, effectively deceit and denial, to copy the name of another book. So let me ask, I guess Dr. Rosner will lead us off, and we'll just go around this way. And again, when Representative Waxman arrives, I will get here. I will say that there are two things that are going very wrong about climate change. One is the carbon pollution that's going up into our atmosphere and into our oceans and causing effects that, recently the World Meteorological Association said it's without any doubt. Those days are past of doubt. The second is the pollution of our democracy by the polluting interests in a desire to win a political victory that prevents action on climate change and puts their selfish interests ahead of the interests of all of the rest of us. And this apparatus that we're looking at today is part of that second form of pollution, the pollution of our democracy, which is a very important form of pollution. If you think of America as the shining city on the hill, if you think of American democracy as a lamp to other nations, if you think of the President Clinton's comment that the power of our example has always been more important than the example of our power, these polluters are making a very bad example of the democracy that should be a shining light to the world and causing us to simply fail to take action on a problem that's going to have very serious consequences in the future. So this isn't a small matter. This is a matter that affects an urgent issue of the well-being and habitation under customary conditions of our planet. It's also an issue that reflects very, very poorly on a democracy whose most powerful effect in this world is how it shows itself to the rest of the world. When they do the dirt that they do, it creates very significant consequences. So with that, Dr. Rosner.
Okay. First of all, thank you very much for inviting me. This is a great honor to be here and a wonderful opportunity, and I especially just want to acknowledge Senator Whitehouse's extraordinary contribution to this issue, both here in the Senate, but also in his home state of Rhode Island. We first, as Senator Whitehouse mentioned, first met him, I guess now about 14 or 15 years ago, when he began what was essentially a model attempt to try to find a way of addressing and holding accountable an industry that has literally been responsible for perhaps the longest-lasting, longest-running public health tragedy in American history. The problem of childhood lead poisoning, the fact that over the course of the past century, literally millions of American children have been affected by lead and its effects on their neurology and on their brains. At that time, Senator Whitehouse started a lawsuit that asked not just for compensation for the damage already done from a century of pollution from lead, but actually demanded of the industry that they provide the funds to actually stop future damage of lead, to stop the future damage to Rhode Island's children by demanding that money be given to the state to remove lead from the walls of Rhode Island. This was a remarkable public health lawsuit that was unique in American history at that time and has caused major repercussions. In the longest lawsuit in Rhode Island's history, in civil lawsuit, it resulted in a judgment by a jury of a $4 billion verdict that asked for money to be provided to remove lead from the walls of the state. This was huge. It was, as Jerry and I often say, the high point of our professional lives as academics to have participated in this case and to be part of what is essentially a huge public health victory. That was the high point of our life.
Then our Supreme Court got into it.
Well, the low point of our life was about 2 years later when their Supreme Court decided to reverse it on some bizarre legalistic claim that I don't quite understand, but somehow they didn't bring it to court under the right law. I don't quite get it. But in any case, it was a huge victory and a huge defeat, but it served as a model for a case that is now going forward in California that we should all be watching very clearly, carefully in Representative Waxman's state, which is modeled on the Rhode Island case in many ways, in which the cities of San Diego, Los Angeles, San Francisco, Berkeley, Oakland have sued the industry similarly, not for compensation for past damage to children or past damage to the environment, but now for actually monies to remove lead from the walls of those cities. It's a huge case. It went to trial last summer, and it again resulted, Jerry and I were very proud to be part of it, and we were so proud of the role that history played in it, with over a $1 billion verdict demanding that the companies pay for their past acts and for the negligence they showed in their historical actions regarding the dispersal of lead over an entire state, the pollution of an entire state, and the damage done to children in the past, and the need to prevent it in the future. It's now being appealed, and just yesterday, the appeal reached the appeals court with statements by the industry that ironically argues and ironically says, because our evil acts of denial and deceit and our lying occurred so long ago, they don't use these words, okay? It occurred so long ago, why should we be held accountable now? This, what I'd just like in very few minutes, because of course, Jerry's going to tap me on the shoulder.
I have one more minute.
Are you kidding? My students accuse me of speaking in 45-minute bursts, so I have to apologize. But essentially, for the first 3/4 of the century, of the past century, since 1914, a century ago, when the first cases of childhood lead poisoning were diagnosed in Baltimore, right up the river here, children went into palsies, comas, and died from exposure to lead paint. Since the 1980s and 1990s, children have other forms of low-level neurological damage. Since 1914, the industry has systematically either gone about trying to deny that lead was a poison, trying to suppress information about knowledge that it had in its own files, deny the fact that in its own meetings it was discussing children going into comas and dying from lead on cribs and toys, going back literally to 1928, that throughout history they have gone to different industries and different doctors who have diagnosed lead poisoning and challenged them, threatening some doctors with up to $1 million lawsuits in 1945, threatening them with threats to their reputations, going to physicians in the 1970s and 1980s who were understanding the low effects of low-level lead and actually tying them up in courts and in hearings and in university threats about their academic integrity, actually tying their whole lives up for years, literally years. I don't have any time, and I know that Jerry's going to really pull me back. But the point is, literally for a century now, this is a cautionary tale of what happens when an industry learns about the bad things it is doing and the bad things it's done. It's applicable to a whole host of situations, certainly to climate change. But when we look at the history of lead, we see in some sense the mother of industrial toxins, the best documented industrial poison, and we can understand and see what an industry does when its profits are threatened.
They don't confess and apologize?
Can you confess and apologize?
They don't confess and apologize? That's not the...
There's some reason, I don't know what culture they come from, but that doesn't seem to be part of their religion.
Got it. Congressman Waxman has joined us, the legendary Congressman Waxman. Could say a few words, I'd appreciate it.
Thank you, Senator Whitehouse, and I appreciate all of our witnesses being here today. The Bicameral Task Force on Climate Change has tried to bring out a number of issues about the climate change threat, and we've had hearings about the problems of fire, problems of victims in certain areas of the country, and to give a different perspective of why we need to act on climate change. Senator Whitehouse and his staff developed this hearing today, and I think it's an ingenious and a very appropriate one, and that's to look at the history of deception in denying what's happening, denying science. And I have to say, as I conclude my congressional career, I've seen this over and over again. We held hearings on the tobacco industry. Their campaign was very, very sophisticated over decades to deny the fact, or to at least keep open in people's minds, that maybe it wasn't true that cigarette smoking caused death and disease. And we've seen other industrial denials as well. We've heard, and probably going to hear some more about the lead threat. Oftentimes we talk about industrial threats from carcinogens, which can lead to cancer many years down the road. But the threat of lead to children is almost an immediate threat, and one that those who are putting lead into the air consistently denied. The history of the Clean Air Act is also a history of exaggerated claims by industry that never came true. In May 1989, Ford Motor Company testified, quote, "We just do not have the technology to comply," end quote, with the first tier of new tailpipe standards in the 1990 law. And they said that there was no technology even on the horizon. When the law was passed, in fact, motor vehicle industry began making vehicles that met the new standards in 1993. In October 1990, Mobil Corporation opposed the new Clean Air Act requirements for reformulated gasoline, and they wrote that technology to meet these standards simply does not exist today, and they predicted major supply disruptions. Well, the law was adopted, and in fact, reformulated gasoline requirements went into effect in 1995, 5 years later, in the nation's most polluted cities without significant supply disruptions. In January 1990, DuPont testified that accelerating the phase-out of ozone-depleting chlorofluorocarbons would cause severe economic and social disruptions. In fact, the phase-out of CFC production occurred even faster than DuPont feared, with none of the severe dislocations. We overcame these denials in the past, and we've emerged with good, strong laws, as well as an economy that has prospered, in part because of these efforts. So I'm pleased we're looking at the denial of science by those who have a self-interest economically to deny it, and they convince themselves, I presume, and they try to convince others for their own economic self-interest. That is what is happening on climate change, and we need to bring this fact out because in the House, the leadership, the people who are running the committee with jurisdiction, won't even have a hearing with the scientists on climate change because they say there's no such a thing as climate change and it's not worth our time, while they go on and yell about a war on coal and how wrong the administration is to even take this issue on, because, of course, they won't take it on themselves. So I'm pleased that we're having this hearing and looking at the pattern that we've seen over the years, deny the science, come back and say that they can't achieve any efforts to reduce the pollution, and argue that the pollution doesn't harm anybody. Sometimes they even argue that the pollution's good for you. But no one should believe it. Thank you, Senator.
Thank you very much, Representative Waxman. I'll let you introduce your colleague, but before I do, let me point out that David Rosner is the Ronald H. Lauderstein Professor of Sociomedical Sciences and a Professor of History and co-director of the Center for the History of Public Health at the Mailman School of Public Health at Columbia University, not Columbia University. He comes to us from New York and not from South America.
That's right. Thank you very much.
We have with us my colleague from the House, Congressman Lowenthal, who is going to be taking on the Safe Climate Caucus in the House of Representatives, an organization I chair that is giving us the opportunity to speak out about climate change on the House floor, where we do have an opportunity to speak, even though we don't have hearings and can't call those hearings. But this is an issue that he cares deeply about, and I want to welcome him to the hearing.
Please.
Yeah, thanks.
Professor Markowitz is from the City University of New York, Distinguished Professor of History at John Jay College and Graduate Center, and also at Columbia University. Neither is South American. Adjunct Professor of Sociomedical Sciences at the Mailman School of Public Health, along with his colleague, Professor Rosner.
Thank you very much, Senator. I'm going to be talking about the chemical industry and specifically the plastics industry, and talking about a period in the 1970s when plastics and PVC specifically was a billion-dollar industry and growing dramatically. And researchers found that the essential ingredient of PVC, that is vinyl chloride monomer, caused cancer in some animals. But it was not in a part of the rat that humans have the same organ, so they were interested, but they were not overtly concerned. Nevertheless, the European chemical industry and the U.S. chemical industry both started secret research projects on the carcinogenicity of vinyl chloride. And in doing this research, they both signed secrecy agreements with each other saying that they would not reveal what each other found. And at that point, about a year later, the Europeans did indeed find that vinyl chloride caused a very rare liver cancer in rats. And of course, people do have livers. So they were very concerned, and even more concerned because the level at which the rats were getting this rare liver cancer was at half what the chemical industry was recommending that workers be exposed to. So they were extremely concerned. At about this same time, NIOSH, which was a new organization having been established in 1970 with OSHA, asked for information about a wide range of chemicals. What did industry know about the potential dangers of a variety of chemicals? And they asked for this information about vinyl chloride in particular. And the industry understood. They said they had a moral obligation to tell the government what they knew. And yet, they set up a meeting with NIOSH, and in the planning of that meeting, they determined that they were not going to tell what they knew. They had a choice. They could have a loyalty to the U.S. government, or they could have a loyalty to their European chemical counterparts. And the strategy they developed was that they said, if the government asks us a specific question about that research, we'll answer it. But of course, the government didn't know about the research, so they couldn't ask a specific question about that research. And they came out of the meeting with the government and said, phew, we, dodged the bullet. The government is not going to take precipitous action because they hadn't been given the information that would lead them to take precipitous action. 6 months later, the industry was faced with a real crisis because there were 4 of these same rare liver cancers that occurred in workers in a Goodrich plant in Louisville, Kentucky. And so you could no longer, when actual workers get this very rare disease, it could no longer be denied. And OSHA immediately lowered the level at which workers should be exposed dramatically. And they proposed a permanent standard of essentially no detectable limit, 1 part per million. And the industry said very much the same kind of response. They said that to achieve that level would be technologically and economically infeasible, and that large segments of the PVC industry would have to close down. And these were industry statements that were trumpeted by the Wall Street Journal, and the Wall Street Journal continued to present this kind of material from industry. And yet, a year after
the editorial page, to be clear.
No, this was actually in the news section. They quoted the industry representatives, and yet a year later, after the federal court upheld the standards, all the companies, except for one very small company, met the standards, were able to implement the standards, and the industry was thriving. It was doing so well that it even reduced the price of PVC. So this is both an example of deceit, and denial. And it was really a rather dramatic one. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor. Our next witness is Naomi Oreskes. Again, as I said, she's the author of Merchants of Doubt: How a Handful of Scientists Obscured the Truth on Issues from Tobacco to Global Warming. And she's from Harvard University, where she's professor of the history of science and affiliated professor of earth and planetary science. Ms. Oreskes.
Thank you very much. It's an honor to be here, and I want to just thank both Senator Whitehouse and Representative Markey for their great work on this issue. I think the American people really owe you a great debt for all you've done over the years. The note about Colombia makes me not be able to resist an old joke about the time that Dan Quayle was asked to visit Central America, and his staff found him wandering around Ohio. In the 1970s, scientists around the globe warned that harmful climate change was likely to occur before the end of the century. So when NASA scientist James Hansen testified in 1988, right here in the US Congress, that man-made climate change was underway, this was not a scientific surprise. It was the confirmation of a scientific theory, a prediction that had come true. And when George H.W. Bush was elected president later that year, he pledged to use the power of the White House effect to counter the greenhouse effect. 26 years later, disruptive climate change is all around us. We are experiencing stormier storms, hotter heat waves, drier droughts, more dangerous wildfires. Our health and our wealth are at risk. Yet the concrete action that President Bush promised us is nowhere in sight. The U.S. since that time has made no net reductions in greenhouse gas emissions. If we had adhered to the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change, we would have cut emissions by 7%, itself a very modest target. Instead, our emissions have increased 5%. Worldwide, more than half of all greenhouse gas emissions have occurred since 1988, and more than half of those emissions have been produced by the United States. Why have we done so little to act on our knowledge? Why have we done so little to protect ourselves? The answer, at least in part, is because of industry-funded disinformation. The earliest documented disinformation came from the George C. Marshall Institute, who by the early 1990s were working closely with industrial sponsors, arguing variously that there was no warming, that it was not man-made, or that it didn't matter. In 2005, it named as its director William O'Keefe, who had formerly served as executive vice president and chief operating officer of the American Petroleum Institute and registered lobbyist for ExxonMobil. That was also spread by the Greening Earth Society and its affiliate organization, Informed Citizens for the Environment, both wholly funded by the coal industry. The Greening Earth Society promoted the canard that increased atmospheric carbon dioxide would increase agricultural productivity. In other words, pollution is good for you. This is a claim that has been well refuted by actual science, which shows that any small benefit from increased carbon dioxide is swamped by the adverse effects of excess heat and drought. The Global Climate Coalition was a trade organization composed of fossil fuel giants, Exxon, Shell, BP, and Chevron, and other members of what Eric Conway and I have called the carbon combustion complex, including Alcoa, General Motors, Ford, and DuPont. In 2002, they disbanded because their goal of preventing controls on greenhouse gas emissions had been achieved. These groups sowed doubt by questioning the veracity of the scientific data and the integrity of scientists, by asserting that action on climate change would kill jobs, damage the economy, and lead to loss of personal liberty and national sovereignty, and by claiming that climate change would be good for us. They spread disinformation through advertising campaigns, film and videos distributed to schools and libraries, by holding meetings with newspaper editors and radio and television producers to ensure that their side was given equal weight, and by threatening lawsuits against outlets who did not acquiesce. They produced propaganda dressed up as science, which landed on the desks of legislators around the country. And they lobbied vigorously to oppose any limits on fossil fuel production or any support for alternatives. Yet even as they were promoting disinformation, similarly to the story of vinyl chloride and lead, their own experts were telling them that the science was solid. As the New York Times reported in 2009, internal experts of the Global Climate Coalition advised, quote, that the scientific basis for the potential impact of human emissions of greenhouse gases on the climate is well established and cannot be denied, and that was in the 1990s. The history of selling doubt about climate change parallels the history of tobacco, in which the industry used public relations firms, advertising agencies, and think tanks to counter the medical evidence of the harms of tobacco, evidence that their own experts told them was correct. This is not coincidental. Many of the same people and organizations have been involved in both. The founding director of the Marshall Institute, the late Frederick Seitz, worked for R.J. Reynolds Tobacco. The Heartland Institute, the source of a recent billboard campaign comparing climate scientists with terrorists, has a history of association with and funding from Philip Morris. And the disinformation continues. This is history, but it's living history. Last week, the National Center for Science Education revealed the role of the Heartland Institute in misrepresenting the state of climate science in school textbooks. Leading fossil fuel corporations continue to publish misleading advertisements. Industry-funded think tanks continue to claim that the science is unsettled. For more than 2 decades, industry has worked to prevent action on climate change by creating doubt about its reality, its causes, and its significance. The resulting confusion has undermined support for political action, which was, of course, the point. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Oreskes. And now Sheena Thal from Media Matters for America.
Shauna Thiel.
Sheena Thiel, I'm sorry.
It's not, thank you so much for having me. I'm going to go into a few prepared remarks, specifically elaborating on a report that we did. Some of you might have grabbed the handout that was out front. And you can see on that handout all the documentation of what I'm going to go over. The greatest trick the oil companies ever pulled was convincing the world that climate change doesn't exist. Just take one look at the media and you'll realize why so many Americans don't realize that we're facing a climate crisis. Just as carbon dioxide levels were breaking historical records and top international scientists were releasing a comprehensive report on climate change, the New York Times was cutting its environmental coverage and broadcast media were continuing to offer little coverage. When the media fail to cover climate change, it allows opponents to attack policies promoting a clean economy without offering up their own solutions. Chief among the more sophisticated of these critics is the Wall Street Journal's editorial page. So Media Matters took a look at their methods. We looked at more than 100 editorials from 1976 to 2012, and we found that the arguments that the journal makes to delay climate action are the same as those that they use to argue against action on acid rain and ozone depletion, and they were shown to be repeatedly on the wrong side of history. I'm going to go over 3 rhetorical plays that the Wall Street Journal runs over and over in order to show you what you can look out for, not just from the journal, but also from other influential players who adopt these same tactics. The first is the delay tactic. The Wall Street Journal often asserts that we don't know enough yet. Scientists are about as certain that climate change is real and man-made as they are that cigarettes kill. But the journal will ignore this and seize upon any uncertainties about particular aspects of the science to claim that we need to study it more before we act. They've run this play before. In 1976, for example, a journal editorial stated that we needed to study ozone depletion more before acting. But more than a decade later, in 1989, they were still claiming we needed more research. They used the same tactic with acid rain. In 1984, the journal asked for a few more years of research before regulating the emissions driving acid rain. But a few years and a comprehensive National Academy of Sciences report later, the Wall Street Journal was still saying we needed to wait for science to understand the causes of acid rain. They keep running the same playbook, regardless of the facts. The second tactic is to forecast economic doom. The Wall Street Journal frequently claims that acting on any given environmental threat will destroy our economy. In reality, studies show that reducing carbon pollution through market-based programs would have little impact on the economy, but the journal claims it would cost millions of jobs. And again, back in the 1980s, the journal also wildly overstated how much it would cost to address acid rain, claiming upwards of $100 billion. Nowadays, it is widely accepted, even by the journal, that the acid rain program not only reduced emissions significantly, but also did so cheaply. The same thing happened when scientists warned us that we needed to eliminate the pollutants destroying the ozone layer. The journal predicted that replacing these pollutants would be prohibitively expensive, but they were proven wrong by technological innovation, as Representative Waxman went over, that reduced the expenses and made it so that we were able to address ozone depletion through technological innovation. We can invest in innovative research again and encourage businesses to do the same, but we have to ignore the naysayers. After all, they'll keep running the same playbook regardless of the facts. And the third and final tactic is to attack the motives of activists, suggesting that science can't be trusted because it's motivated by politics. It's a sophisticated way to launch a political attack on the science while claiming that your opponents are the political ones. In 1983, the journal was claiming that the campaign to regulate sulfur dioxide emissions was motivated by how politically appealing the issue was. Quote, in true Madison Avenue fashion, acid rain sells. And now the journal claims that the top scientists warning about climate change are really just putting together sloppy political documents. That's a convenient way to dismiss in one fell swoop thousands of studies compiled by hundreds of scientists. It's time to wake up and be wary of those who pretend they need just a few more studies to be convinced. And then when the studies come in, throw up their hands and say it's simply too expensive. They'll run the same playbook regardless of the facts. And in the face of this categorical opposition, we need to move forward, knowing that the 24-hour news cycle may focus on those kicking and screaming in the background, but the history books will tell the story of those who acted on the best science, used the greatest technology, and helped us to avoid catastrophe. Thanks for having me.
Thank you very much. We've mentioned a few of the players who have sort of persisted through time across tobacco, ozone, acid rain, vinyl chloride, lead paint, climate change. Who would you add to the list of who the kind of consistent players are? Wall Street Journal editorial page, Heartland Institute, George C. Marshall Institute. There are probably a solid dozen more who are in the array of phony baloney stacked up organizations designed to look like scientific organizations. Let's name a few names here.
Yeah, there's a whole slew of think tanks that I didn't mention because time was short, and most of them are based here in DC. The Cato Institute, the Heritage Foundation, Competitive Enterprise, American Enterprise, Frontiers of Freedom, Committee for the Constructive Tomorrow, the Acton Institute, the Hudson Institute. So it's a long list.
Council.
Right, there's at least a dozen of them that are active on climate change issues. There's also a whole set of trade group, the American Council for Health and Industry. You guys probably have come across those guys. I've forgotten.
Council for Science and Health.
That's an American, and they all have these sort of very nice-sounding names. I mean, it's Orwellian, right? American Council for Science and Health is the American Council to undermine science and health. So that's one major group. Some of the same public relations firms, Hill and Knowlton, Birch and Marsteller, you see being involved in these campaigns using the same strategies and tactics. Very convenient for them because they don't have to do the work. They already know how to do it. And then also, I was going to say one other thing, the use of the so-called astroturf groups, funding organizations, what the industry calls third-party allies, people who appear to be independent, look like citizens groups. So this group, the so-called Informed Citizens for the Environment, was a wholly funded front organization for the Western Fuels Association, a group of Powder River Coal Basin people. But by making a title that makes it sound as if it's grassroots, and by hiding the fingerprints, so having an address here in DC separate from the actual coal producers who are funding it, give the impression of independence and give the impression of citizen activism.
One organization that you mentioned that does tie all of these industries together, it seems, is Hill and Knowlton. The fact that there's
Hill and Knowlton.
It's a public relations firm that seems to be throughout history going into everything we've ever looked at. Their name sooner or later appears, and they sooner or later come out with the same playbook. One, in the 1960s, it was amazing. After 50 years of understanding the dangers of lead, they do a survey of the American people for the lead industry, and what they find is that most people do not really understand where that problem is. They know lead's a danger, but they don't associate it with lead in gasoline and lead in paint, and they tell the industry this. And the industry goes and gloats about its own internal success in making sure that people haven't understood what the danger is. So Hill and Knowlton, I think, and the public relation firms that shape the policies unite a lot of different industries in a common policy that we've been all outlining here.
I will mention, going back to our lead paint lawsuit, that one good permanent thing that did come out of it was that rather than face depositions and answer interrogatories, the Lead Industry Association pulled the plug on itself and shut itself down. They were not interested in that. So one down, many to go. Any you'd add, Shauna, to this constellation of denial?
From the media side, if you talk about front groups, there's also the Franklin Institute will front for will mostly dark money funneled through donors' trust, but they're able to get reports in local media that are, you might think at first glance, come from your local reporters, but are actually funded by an organization whose explicit purpose is to get a more conservative slant. That might be, it might not be very blatantly an opinion piece, but they'll feed in conservative slant into these articles in your local papers.
Yeah, and that's a really important point that I think is worth underscoring. I don't personally care for the Wall Street Journal, but in some ways I think the more noxious and threatening activity is the use of local newspapers. So we know that many of these groups target local radio, local television, small town newspapers, and they supply information to these editors and newspaper reporters, many of whom are understaffed, don't have backgrounds in science, and so they absorb this information and then they report it. I studied one particular campaign that specifically targeted what were considered to be sort of mainstream American communities like Peoria, Illinois, Bowling Green, Kentucky. The idea that if they could get the message directly to these local media outlets, they didn't have to worry about editors anywhere else. And that proved to be a very effective strategy by their own accounts. And then they did market research to see whether or not their campaigns were working, found that they were, and then fund a large-scale mass media campaign.
And on the local media side, also, Americans for Prosperity will have small groups in each state that oftentimes the media, if they're reporting on something that Americans for Prosperity won't do, we've seen local news not report that they're essentially a Koch front group. But also, even more perniciously, is that in Tennessee there was a rollback on public transit, and the only reason that it came out that Americans for Prosperity was the one trying to pull back public transit projects was because a local group said, and thanks to Americans for Prosperity for helping us with all this messaging and money, kind of messed up, got it out there, then it got into the media and got into a national story. So who knows how many other local groups are being helped by Americans for Prosperity local groups, and it's not being revealed in the media.
Well, I've seen all of these things when the arguments have come to the Congress. They've already built up a whole grassroots effort and propagandized the media, got their message out. And I've heard, I remember, because we're now looking at the great success of the efforts to stop the depletion of the ozone layer by reducing CFCs, and the White House had a meeting, the other White House had a meeting about the HFCs and how if we can reduce the HFCs that deplete the ozone layer, that's a very potent greenhouse gas, and we're seeing success. But I remember when that issue came up in 1977, a colleague of mine said, I don't think the science is ready yet. The scientists haven't been able to prove beyond a reasonable doubt that chlorofluorocarbons cause a depletion of the ozone layer, which shocked me because I never thought we had to prove beyond a reasonable doubt that something was occurring that was endangering people's health and other environmental consequences. So I've heard the argument, we don't know yet the science. The scientists haven't yet concluded it. That's what the tobacco industry said, that's what the ozone depleters said. Then we've had people, of course, when the science establishes the connections, they say, well, science, that's just another political point of view. In fact, they're motivated by politics. They're doing this for the environmental lobby. So you get that argument. But the point I want to ask you about is with climate change, it's a little different. When we were talking about acid rain, the people in the Midwest denied it. But the people in the Northeast saw the consequences, and they pushed for action. When we came to tobacco, the tobacco industry owned the Republican leadership in the House of Representatives when Newt Gingrich became Speaker. I mean, owned them. Tom DeLay was indicted for a crime and flew to Texas to plead not guilty on a tobacco industry airplane. And they wouldn't even bring up bipartisan legislation. But tobacco was not a partisan issue, except Republicans in power blocked us from dealing with it. With climate change, we almost have a belief based on partisanship. Republicans, it's a mantra of being a good Republican that you don't want to do anything about climate change because it's not really a problem. And if it's a problem, there's nothing we can do anything about anyway because we're not the cause of it. Either we're not the cause of it because people don't add to it, or we're not the cause of it because it's some other country, and why should we do anything about it? Why do you think this change in the playbook has taken place, where they've co-opted a Republican Party, and most Republicans in this country have to overcome the burden of thinking that if their political party is against doing something about climate change, this must be a partisan issue, and the scientists must be liberals or Democrats or communists or socialists. Why has that now become a successful strategy?
Well, that was part of the key playbook that the Marshall Institute began going back to 1989. And it was tied up with Cold War ideology and a kind of fear that climate change would be used as a backdoor to socialism, that it would lead to an increase in government regulation, an increase in government intervention in the marketplace, and that would undermine free market principles. So that argument was made very powerfully early on, and it aligned people who had an obvious financial self-interest, like ExxonMobil or Chevron, with people who had an ideological commitment to free market politics, which included many Republicans in Congress, many Americans across the United States. And I think it was that combination of the financial backing of those with self-interest and a kind of, what's the right word, authentic ideological commitment to a certain set of principles that proved extremely powerful and then got taken up by the Republican leadership. And then there was a deliberate campaign of deliberate polarization, right, to persuade Republicans that this was all just a liberal myth. And we've seen that idea propagated, unfortunately, by some of Senator Whitehouse's colleagues from Oklahoma, Texas, and elsewhere. So it's not a coincidence. It was part of a strategy, and we're seeing the results of that strategy now.
But also the ability to create doubt and the fact that we run off the principle of as long as there is uncertainty, we cannot act, which is diametrically contrary to actually principles being espoused by the European Union right now, which is arguing that we should be showing precaution, that in the absence of absolute clarity and absolute truth and absolute certainty within science, we should be very cautious about introducing new materials, introducing new technologies, introducing new environmental pollutants that potentially will have harm down the road. So the burden in our country has always been on proving something dangerous before banning it because we believe in the free market, and that's become a mantra. Government cannot do anything to interfere in that, while the Europeans, with a very different kind of political tradition, have adopted a very different set of principles around the environment, which are potentially much more protective.
I think that's true, and I think it's very important. I would add to that, though, that in the case of climate change, we're not talking about precaution anymore. If we had acted in 1988, that would have been precautionary. We're way past precaution at this stage.
So yeah, I think you raised a few points about we're showing parallels with history, but obviously with any historical case, there's going to be differences. And one of the biggest differences with climate change is just psychologically, it's not easy to get action because it's this long-term problem. It doesn't have the sort of, how you were talking about in the Northeast, there were people that knew acid rain effects were there, and it wasn't, like we see local impacts of climate change, wildfires in California, but people might not connect it with climate change as much. So that's one of the differences, is that it's a much more difficult problem to get people to care about, just based on the psychology. And the second is how I think is more of an issue of Congress sorting on the right and the left on all issues, and not necessarily to do with this particular issue that, we've seen there's no longer any compromise on any of the issues.
Yeah, I think the biggest difference isn't really how it affects people, because people in California are being affected by climate change, and they are connecting the dots. And people in the Northeast saw Superstorm Sandy, and they connected the dots. I think the biggest difference is who's in the leadership of the Republican Party. I mean, I don't exactly want to make a hero of George H.W. Bush, but the fact is he supported action on acid rain, and the Republicans supported the cap and trade under the Clean Air Act amendments to control acid rain. Now we have a very different kind of Republican leadership in power.
And John McCain ran for president on a very strong climate change platform.
Exactly, and Senator McCain's reversal, I think, to me, is really emblematic of what has happened to the Republican Party, and really sad, almost tragic, really.
Well,
Representative Lowenthal,
just to answer
I
Ms.
also think that we're not going to deal with many of these issues today without dealing with the corruptive influence of money on politics, and who gets elected, and why the Republican Party has little latitude to move, because they're totally dependent. It's very interesting to watch from the California legislature, where it played a role in AB 32, and I think that within our state there's a really understanding, at least with the majority. But we're now seeing ads by the Koch brothers, not talking about what their carbon-based products, but all the good that they do. They're now an attempt to even more obfuscate. But when you really look at it, we're talking about people who are totally dependent on survival, on economic resources that come in. And until we deal with some of those issues, we're not going to deal with, they're going to obfuscate and cloud the issue. We're not going to deal with this issue. Begin to deal with some of the issues around money, because they have the money.
To put a highlight on Representative Lowenthal's point, the history of Republican involvement in remedying climate change, which was very strong and involved, as I said, John McCain's presidential candidacy, Susan Collins's tax and dividend, cap and dividend bill, Mark Kirk voting for Waxman-Markey in the House, Jeff Flake writing articles supporting a carbon tax or carbon fee, and on and on and on, all came to a sudden halt in January of 2010. January of 2010 was when Citizens United took place. And what Citizens United did was not only allow big corporations and billionaires to spend unlimited amounts in elections, but from a political point of view, much more pertinently, to threaten or promise to do so. And with the arrival of that threat or promise onto the political landscape, even very demonstrably, heroically courageous members of Congress had no choice but to fold their tents. And today, the ramparts of the castles of denial are patrolled by the Koch brothers, and they will shoot anyone, figuratively, who tries to escape by pulling out their money and funding their opponent. And it's as simple as that. And we know from conversations that there are a great number of Republicans in the Senate who believe we need to do something on this subject. But they use words like, I want to be there with you, Sheldon, but we've got to be really deft about it. Or, I can't do it yet. I can't do it yet. I got to find my way. There's no safe political lane for them now, and that's been shut down by Koch brothers polluter money and the absolute dependence, as Representative Lowenthal pointed out, of the Republican Party on that funding source right now. It also taps into a long-standing conservative concern in America that any new government intervention interferes with freedom. And I was reading a book the other day, and it described back at the end of the 18th century, a new government program was proposed, and it was criticized as, quote, a pretext to raise taxes and hire a host of revenue officers to collect them, and then farewell freedom in America. The new government program was the United States Navy. So there's a long history of that argument being applied to a variety of different government activities. Well, thank you all.
Well, could I just jump in so we don't end on a depressed note? If you look back, all of these barriers were there on tobacco, on lead, on all these other chemicals, on acid rain. It took time, it took a struggle, and it took people who are willing to stand up and fight. And despite all the obstacles, the American people eventually, God willing, understand what's going on, and their representatives finally get to the point where you're going to do things. But to those who are going to be in Congress after I'm gone, and to those who are on the outside talking about these issues, don't give up. Keep fighting, because it's just too important that we explain to people who believe in free markets that there are market failures. And one of the clearest market failures is to ask somebody to spend money to reduce pollution unless their competitors also have to do the same thing. That is a basic explanation in a very simplified form of why government needs to set the standards and set the rules, and then let everybody comply with those rules. But we can do it.
Representative Lowenthal, closing remarks?
No, I'm just pleased to be one who will continue on in the fight.
Well, we are going to miss Representative Henry Waxman, who has been a leader in so many fights and has one of the most remarkable and distinguished records the Congress of the United States will ever see. I think this is our last Bicameral Task Force event together, and it has been one of the great privileges of my career to be able to share these Bicameral Task Force events with you. I am a pup by comparison, and I've had the opportunity to learn from a master who, in addition to being a master himself, has also developed and trained and kept around him an extraordinarily talented staff, which has made his office a powerhouse both in the majority and out. And so let me say thank you very, very much, Henry Waxman. Thank you to our witnesses, not only for your testimony here today, which was so important, but also for the work around this hearing that you have done in so many ways to point out the fact that the denial that we so often see from industry is a standardized propaganda method coming from just bewildering enough array of false front operations that they can put one over on the public and on the media. And we will get to the day that Henry Waxman has prophesied sooner, once the American public is aware of the scam and has had a chance to look behind the curtain. Thank you all very much.
Thank you.
I'm not too.
It was.
Yes, we'll take care of it.
Yeah, thank you. Well, you did a wonderful job. I'm sorry it came in the middle.